Hey, good afternoon. I'm Tracy Thomas. I'm the director here at the library, and I just wanted to welcome you quickly to the library today. Thank you so much for coming out. We are really excited. Professor Davis has got great information. I know if you came to the other one, you know that he's full of great information on genealogy research. We have a fantastic genealogy room here at the Comer Library. If you've never checked it out, we invite you to do so at some point. I also want to just mention today, before I turn it over to Catherine, to introduce Professor Davis, I wanted you to know that this series is sponsored by Don and Kim Ward. If you are from Sylacauga, you may recognize the Ward's name, but what I really want you to know is all the money that Don and Kim donate to the Library Foundation, they donated in memory of his mom and dad, Betty and Fuzzy Ward. So I just want you to know that we have special people that are really, they're really dedicated to making sure that we can provide quality programs. We call these the frosting on the cake programs that we might not get to have otherwise, but we do have a sponsor for them. So thank you so much for coming today. Catherine Dobbs is our employee here at the library, and she's put a lot of time into working with Professor Davis and making sure that this goes off well. So I'm going to turn it over to her to introduce. And thank you for coming, Professor Davis, and thank you, Catherine.
Good afternoon and welcome to the B.B. Comer Memorial Library. We have with us again today our presenter, Robert Davis, Senior Professor of History at Wallace State Community College. Professor Davis, welcome, and we thank you for being with us today for the second installment of our genealogy series. At this time, I'm going to turn the program over to you, Professor Davis.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. To add to what the introduction and such, for those of you who've heard me speak before, you know I'm full of something. Okay. Now, a quick commercial here. I run the genealogy collection at the library at Wallace State College in Hansville, Alabama, not to be confused with the other two Wallace State colleges. But anyway, we have a fabulous collection. I hope I'll be seeing you there. It's free. You don't have to register for anything. You just need to show up at the library when it's open, and we'll be happy to help you with that. Also, I teach continuing education classes in genealogy. These are on Wednesday and Thursday nights. We still have a couple of them for this semester. I beg your pardon, we have one more for this semester. That will be on the Civil War. But anyway, this summer we've got all the classes coming back. So maybe you'll want to join us for that. If you'd like to be on our mailing list, and we do not share our mailing list with anyone, so we're not like Katie's Kitty Boutique or something where if you get on their mailing list and you're on everybody's mailing list. No, nothing like that. But anyway, my email address is on your slides, so just drop me a note and say that you want to be on our genealogy mailing list, as this is. Now, by the way, all the slides you see today are on this handout, and also you've got a whole stack of my handouts from our collection at Wallace State that I will refer to during this talk. Now, one of the reasons so many people come to our collection at Wallace State is our handouts. I once saw a little old lady come through with a wheelbarrow, I think it was. No, there was no wheelbarrow, but anyway, she came through with an armload of our handouts. And I said, "You're not here to do research?" She said, "No, I just came for the handouts." I held the door for her and she left. Anyway, you may find yourself doing the same thing, but we have a fabulous resource in our handouts, All right, well, let's get on with this now. All right, first off, this is an impossible subject to cover. There have been times when I've taught Southern research for an entire semester, and we're going to do it in 2 hours. But we will do it. Now, of course, this requires a lot of judgment on my part, and sometimes my judgment isn't the best, but let's not delve into my past history. Okay, anyway, as far as the judgment goes, you're going to hear some things. You're going to say, why is he doing this in a Southern research class? And the reason is because it is so relevant to Southern research. And then there may be some favorite source you know of that I don't cover because it's so small, there's just so much you can cover and only so much you can cover. Now, unfortunately, we live in an age when too many people do all their family history research online. Libraries are seriously suffering. Libraries are suffering all the way across the board, not just in genealogical research. And then, of course, COVID has not made anything better. But the thing of it is, the internet, which I dearly love and I use all the time, is just one tool in your toolbox. Visiting wonderful libraries like the Comer Library and my library and the Birmingham Public Library, the National Archives in Washington, sources like that, that's another tool in your toolbox. And of course, interviewing your living relatives for the information they might contain, they might carry, they might have to give to you, that's still another tool. But don't deny any tool in your toolbox, because that's the only way you succeed, is by bringing all the information that you can get from all the sources you can get, bringing it all together, and then using your powerful deductive abilities, as Sherlock Holmes would say, to solve the mystery and to see how the crime was committed, which is one friend of mine refers to his family as this goes. All right, well, not all of us can have Blackbeard in our family tree. Okay, moving right along. Okay, now, first off, many of these states have specific research guides. Many of them have specific research guides. For example, Maryland has Eleanor Pisano's An Index to Source Records of Maryland. Librarians in the state where you're researching, they can give you advice on good books for research on their particular state. Ancestry's Red Book, America's State, County, and Town Sources. I'm sure there's a copy here. Every good genealogical library has a copy. They wrote a chapter on every state in the United States and every possession of the United States, like the District of Columbia. And there's a chapter on each, and each chapter was written by a local expert. Modesty forbids me to mention that I wrote the chapters on Alabama, Georgia, and almost Florida. Okay. Now, anyway, this is critically important for the South for two major reasons. First off, there is no region of the country more diverse on a state-by-state basis in its records than the South, period. I do not know any two southern states that are anything alike, as you will see in this talk. And the second thing about this, with the differences, is that the South is lacking so many important records, or there are records that are important in other regions. For example, our cousins in New England, they have birth and death records going back to 1640. We have nothing like that in the South. And in the North, more people could read and write, more Bible records have survived. They have wonderful resources. The New England Historic Genealogical Society. You're researching a New England family, they must be your first stop. They are wonderful. And for the Mid-Atlantic states, the New York Historical and Biographical Society, great institution. But the South, our records are inconsistent, and sometimes they're just plain not there. So we have to be more creative than our Yankee cousins. Although my Yankee cousins tell me that nobody gives them a break on having easy records. You find your family tree in the Massachusetts Vital Records books, that's fine, but you've got to go out and find other records to back up what you find in the Vital Records. Okay, as that goes. William Dollarhide, he has published a book on every state in the country. He's also published books on regions of the country. We have them all at Wallace State. But these are what he calls his name list books, like Alabama Name List. Great book. Anyway, he lists in that every source he could find that will help you find your ancestor within that state in a given part and place and time. That's called a people finder. People finders are very, very important because you can't go looking for the birth and death records. You can't go looking for your cousins. You can't look for local historical sources on your family unless you know where your family was at a certain given time. people finders are so critical for that. And particularly in the South, because for many places like burned out counties, sometimes the people finders are all we've got because there are no other records that survive. Well, anyway, his name list is just that. And there's a book for every state, telling you what name lists are available that he knows of. Okay. Now, the South, because, well, for whatever reason, a huge number of the South's local government records, we're talking deeds, wills, estates, etc., were microfilmed by the Mormons, by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. These records have now been scanned, and they're on the internet on the free site FamilySearch.org. You go to FamilySearch.org, you click on search, you click on the catalog, and then you type in the geographic location you're interested in, and you get this wonderful bibliography of all the things the Mormons have on that county, that state, whatever you're researching. Only problem is that some of the records, for reasons I do not understand, are closed to you unless you're at a Mormon research center. But if that happens to you, just read the instructions. Oh, excuse me, and go from there, As I said, other regions also have some great libraries. If you're researching in the upper Midwest, I highly recommend the Allen County Fort Wayne Public Library. They are the second largest genealogical library in America. They try to cover the whole country, but they really have a great Midwestern flavor to them. So if you're looking for Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Wisconsin, places like that. And for the southern Midwest, I recommend the Lloyd DeWitt Boxtruck Genealogy Collection. In other words, the genealogy collection at the Dallas Public Library. And by the way, I really don't have the time in this talk, but I will mention from time to time, if you have to visit these places with someone who doesn't want to do genealogical research, I'm going to suggest tourist places that they can go while you're doing research. For example, if you're at the wonderful Dallas Public Library with its fabulous holdings, probably the third largest genealogical library in the country, third or fourth, you can send the person with you who doesn't want to do research down to Dealey Plaza. It's just down the street, and maybe they can solve the Kennedy assassination. All right. Okay, things that you need to do in advance before you make your research trip. First, check at the state archives about historical societies, special collections libraries, etc., etc. Check the sources that they give you online. Most state archives will give you a list of the libraries with genealogy collections, with the counties with historical and genealogical societies, all this wonderful information on the state archive, the appropriate state archives website. And many of these state archives have fabulous resources online, like our own Alabama Department of Archives and History. Go to their website, look at all the wonderful things they have there. And even some individual county libraries. The Birmingham Public Library click on it, click on genealogy, click on databases, and it's staggering the stuff that they have there for you. I mean, if you would, for some of these places, your first research trip needs to be in your pajamas to your computer just to print off all the wonderful things that they have online for you. Also, it's always important to check ahead at the library and archives you're going to make sure they're going to be open when you're going to be there. And if the library allows you an opportunity, send them an email, and in the email say, listen, I'm coming to visit your library. I intend to be there at this date and this time, if that's okay. Here is what I'm going to research on. And then you type all that in. And some librarians are just wonderful. But you contact the librarians and they will come back and say, well, we don't have much on your family, about 1,200 feet of material that was donated to us, or we have the 9-volume history of your family, but not much more than that. You know, that sort of things. Or you're not allowed to research that family in this county, not after the hanging, or something like that. But they can tell you they can tell you all this valuable information. As I always say, the librarians know where the bodies are buried, particularly at the Fort Payne Public Library, which is in the city cemetery. I actually saw somebody one time, can you tell me how I can find my great-grandmother? And the librarian took them out on the porch and said, you see the angel over there? It's 2 graves to the right. That's where she's buried. Okay, as this is. All right, it's always a good idea to check Worldcat, and it's a free site, and Worldcat is wonderful. It shows you where all these books are located and how close a copy is to you. So maybe there's certain books that you want to see when you go to South Carolina, and lo and behold, according to Worldcat, they're all at the Birmingham Public Library for you, or the B.B. Comer Library for you. Or there's no copy in the South anywhere. I have encountered that. Now, let me clue you in on an important trick there. The Independence of the Mid-Continent Public Library in Independence, Missouri, has a wonderful genealogical collection, and almost all the books in their genealogical collection they will loan on interlibrary loan. I do not know of any other library that does that, but that's what makes their collection so special. So if you find the oddball family history or the oddball book that you want and you can't find it locally or whatever, go and visit your local public library, talk to your interlibrary loan librarian, show them that it's at the Mid-Continent Library, and I bet you dollars for donuts that you can get the book on interlibrary loan. Also, if you only need a few pages from a book or something, most libraries will copy the few pages for you, scan it to you, and they will add a little disclaimer, due to copyright law, please forget where you got this from. Or something to that effect. Okay. Anyways, many books are online. And maybe the book you want is available to you online. That happens to me all the time, and I copy all these pages. And in my footnotes, you would never know that I cheated and just copied the book off the internet. But you can Google books. Hattie Trust is wonderful. I can't say enough good things about it. It is millions of books that have been scanned on the internet, and you have free access to them online. Google Books is a good place to go. Google Scholar is another good place to go. All right, private manuscripts are in a source called Archive Grid, and I've given you the full address to it, because if you try to find it just as Archive Grid, it is a real pain. It is a real pain. But anyway, here is the actual address to it. And this is a catalog of private manuscript collections. Your grandmother always said that your ancestor was a cousin to President Millard Fillmore. And you're saying to yourself, and somebody would want to be the cousin to Millard Fillmore? Really? Well, anyway, you can type in Millard Fillmore genealogy or something on Hattie Trust, or find out where his family papers are, and you can contact that library and find out, say to yourself, oh, thank goodness we're not related to Millard Fillmore, or whatever. But of course, that's an old rule in genealogy. The family stories always have you as a cousin to whoever the most famous person is with your last name, unless your last name is Hitler or something. Okay. Anyway, as this goes. Now, this is a very important clue, and this is a very important trick, and this is one of the many tricks that the professional genealogist uses. And of course, we're all professionals here, aren't we? All right. When you get to the public library of where your family came from, you go through the histories you go to the genealogy room, just like they have here at the Comer Library. You pull out the local histories, the local PhD dissertations that were done, whatever. You check the footnotes and you check the bibliography. If you're at an archives or a special collections library, you check the catalog for the geographic location you are researching. Now, what am I getting at here? Okay, an archives or a library acquires an old store account book, they're going to catalog it as that old store account book. They're not going to index any of the names in the store account book. But you open that store account book, and there's your grandpa buying all of this stuff. And then down at the bottom it says, written off as bad debt, moved to Texas, or something like that. Or his son Joey came in and paid the bill. But anyway, at the very least, when you find an ancestor in the store account book, it's wonderful to peer into their world and see what it was they were buying and how much they paid for it. Now, this also applies to letters and diaries and things of this sort. And there's one other caveat to this, one other. Your brave ancestors served in the American Civil War. Black or white, north or south, whatever, your brave ancestors served in the Civil War. Your ancestor couldn't even read and write, okay? But there was somebody in his regiment that could. And while your ancestor left you no letters, left you no diary, left you no memoirs, other men in his regiment did. And would not letters from somebody in the same regiment, maybe even the same company, or a memoir or a diary, be just about as good as if your ancestor had written them? And most state archives and libraries and whatever catalog their Civil War materials by regiment. By regiment. So you can, or artillery battery or ship or whatever. So that's an important trick too. All right, remember always that our ancestors did not respect county boundaries. They did not respect state boundaries. And between, as this goes. So always check the surrounding counties, even if the surrounding counties are in another state. There is this area I've made up. It's going to be our 51st state, I think, if Puerto Rico doesn't get there first. I call it the state of the Gulf. And this is the area between Gainesville, Florida, and New Orleans, Louisiana, all along the Gulf there. The people there, every census, they're in a different state, having babies in different states. And when you find an honest census record on them, there's Papa from North Carolina, Mama from Georgia, and then here's all the kids, and the kids, Lord help, Florida and Louisiana and Mississippi, and they're just all over the map, literally. Anyway, I call this the state of the Gulf. And by the way, there's a really good library devoted to it, and that is Special Collections at the University of West Florida in Pensacola. They are trying to acquire every printed record, a copy of every printed record of anything ever done on the American Gulf of Mexico, what is called the Redneck Riviera. Anyway, all of that, and that's a great library to visit, particularly when you are in Mobile researching, because Pensacola is only 45 minutes from Mobile. Just don't ask anybody in Mobile for directions. They hate Pensacola. They will tell you that Pensacola sank into the ocean years ago, that they don't have public restrooms, that you don't want to go to Pensacola. You know, you're not even safe in your car in Pensacola. All these ugly, terrible things that are not true. But then again, Pensacola is the most beautiful city on the Gulf, hands down. And I mean both sides of the Gulf. All right, moving right along. Always check it. Okay, we already talked about that, especially to make sure in these days of COVID that you will be able to get into the library. All right, there are 6 P's. There's 6 P's, and we've got them here. Planning, preparation, politeness, patience, persistence, and professionalism. All right, plan your schedule, but be flexible. Check institutions for when they're open, and get directions. Get directions. Know about restrictions on research. I know of a major university special collections that holds one of America's most important historical resources. But if you go into their search room and you mention, oh, I'm a genealogist and I'm here to research great-grandpa, they will politely ask you to leave And then if you don't, they will call security and have you physically removed. They do not do genealogists there. If I didn't publish so much stuff in history, they would have thrown me out years ago. Okay, preparation. Always have a photo ID with you. Always take pencils. Always have a digital camera. Now, some of you are really, really good with your phone at photographing things. Cell phones and digital cameras are the copy machine, modern copy machines. Always use those. Only use a copy machine if it's just not going to work out otherwise. But I prefer a digital camera, but I'm kind of inept with my cell phone. Maybe you're much better at it. Always have coins with you. You never know when you're going to be at an institution that for some quirky reason has to have coins. And our northern cousins, they just enthralled with something called a toll road. I've never understood a toll road, but have plenty of cash on hand to throw into the little basket when asked to do that, particularly in the state of Maryland. Okay, politeness and patience. You are there to do research, not to argue with some petty bureaucrat who's going to call the sheriff. This is particularly true when you're doing research in courthouses. Some of the nicest and most helpful people I've ever met worked in courthouses, and some of the people I most dearly wanted to punch out worked in courthouses. Now, there's a trick to this, however. And that goes with patience and persistence. You show up that you're a professional, that is, you're dressed properly. You are there to stay as long as it takes to do your research. And I swear to you, the longer you are there, the more respect they have for you, and the more helpful they will be, if only to get rid of you. Now, again, I'm talking about government institutions. I'm not talking about libraries. Libraries are always happy to see you. But you've got to see things from their point of view, too. Somebody who's there for eight generations between buses or something, you don't want. They don't like that kind of a person, and I don't blame them. Anyway, persistence. The longer you stay, the better you will be treated. Go with the flow. Always plan on coming back if required. Always plan on another trip if required. And of course, there is a genealogist rule. You always find the best stuff 3 minutes before closing time. I have been thrown out of some wonderful places in my time. And springing and banging on the door, let me back in. I only need to make a few more copies. Okay, professionalism. A professional does not make unreasonable demands. A professional is prepared, and a professional will stay as long as needed. All right, always ask about newspaper resources. I have for years told people when we were talking about genealogy in general that the very bottom of the barrel are two sources that nobody ever looks at. In the day, nobody ever looked at these. Things are changing. First of these, newspapers, because newspapers were so much trouble to go through. Now, millions and millions of pages of newspapers have been scanned, and you can do word searches, and you can find the most wonderful stuff in there. Yes, there are problems with newspaper scans, but I don't have enough time in my life to go through millions and millions of pages of newspapers looking for grandpa when a computer can do it for me at the speed of light. Anyway, ask about newspapers. There are actually some public libraries that have scanned their local newspapers and put them on their library website, and that's where you go to see them, see the newspapers. But ask the librarians about local newspapers that have been scanned. And of course, also ask, by the way, do any of them have their marriages and deaths abstracted in a nice indexed book? We have both in Coleman. Oh, and we can let you look at the originals too, if you absolutely insist. The other great records are court records. Unfortunately, court records remain the great final frontier of genealogy, if you would. Most of our ancestors never appeared in court even as a juror. But if your ancestor does show up in the court records, there could be wonderful things there. You could find where your ancestor died and the whole family fought like cats and dogs over the estate. And in their depositions, they tell you all the things you never knew before, like how everybody's related to everybody and whatever and where they have lived. Naturalizations. Most old naturalization records are in the court records, the county court records, in the big cities and the city court records. Again, and then there's all sorts of other things you can stumble into. Manumissions, for example, where someone sets their slaves free. You can, among other records that you can find there. But unfortunately, well, the good news and bad news. Most court records are easy to go through because there's not that much to them. And the bad news is they seldom have anything like an index. So you just go through it page by page. All right, another final frontier, state and local genealogical journals. Unfortunately, most of these do not have a real index or any index at all, but you'd be surprised the amazing things you can find in a local genealogical journal just reading the table of contents. Just reading the table of contents on this. One of the greatest collections of genealogical periodicals for the South is the Birmingham Public Library. Birmingham Public Library. The greatest collection for the whole country is the Allen County Fort Wayne Library. And they are publishing a monster bibliography of every genealogical article that has been published. And this is called the Periodical Resource Index. It's a few years behind, but it's there. And it's available free online for you to search. And you discover that your Hammond-Tree Family Bible was published in the Tri-Swamp Genealogical Journal in Louisiana. Oh, and there's a little more good news in this. If you find an article in Percy that you would like to have a copy of, you can contact the Allen County Fort Wayne Public Library, and for a very reasonable fee, they will make you a copy of the article. All right. Each of the original 13 colonies has at least one solid colonial history. At least one solid colonial history. This was because there was this big publishing company and they wanted to do a solid colonial history on each of the 13 colonies. And this includes Robert M. Ware's book, Colonial South Carolina, a very good book, I might add. All right. American immigration before the 1820s is very hard to document. If your ancestors left Great Britain for America before the 1820s, they were not leaving a foreign country for another country. They were just simply moving from one part of Great Britain to another. So the records proving that migration are very hard to come by. And of course, Europeans all show up in America from all over. The British tried to naturalize all the foreign-born people who came to America, but most of the foreign-born people who come to America just simply ignore them. Heinrich, you just got to sign up here and become a naturalized citizen, a citizen of good King George I. And Heinrich looks at him and says, I am a good citizen of King George I, you stupid cracker. Understand, maybe my English no good, but King George I, he not speak English at all. Okay. All right. Now, there have been some attempts, and we'll talk about these, to publish the early immigration records, Peter Wilson Coldham, he scraped through all the records he could in England, trying to find any and every record of someone moving from Great England to America, And his books fill an entire bookshelf. And we have them all at Wallace. They're also all available at the Birmingham Public Library. David Dobson tried to do the same thing for Scotland. Neither of them was completely successful. I wasn't going to say this, but I'll be honest. Both of them only found a small percentage of the people who migrated to America. That's just because the records were not kept. But I do envy those of you who do find Grandpa in Immigrants in Chains and books like that. It is always so wonderful to find your immigrant ancestor. And by the way, in memory of the great book Roots, if you ever find an immigrant ancestor, no matter how fancy or important the library is you're researching in, you are supposed to stand up and shout at the top of your lungs, "You old African, I found you." All right. Now let's talk about some sources in the South that you'll want to know about that cross state lines. The Colonial and Revolutionary War records should be sought in individual state archives, although Murdy June Clark published a ton of records on the Colonial South, the Revolutionary War South, and the early Republic that cross state lines. So Murdy June Clark's books. The Federal Archives for the Southern States is the National Archives at Atlanta. It's located in Morrow, Georgia, across the parking lot from the Georgia Archives. Presently, it is closed because of COVID. Now, they have wonderful things there, and you can go online and see all the wonderful things that they have. But they are most valuable to us as genealogists because they have the federal court records for each of the states in the South. Now, your chance of your ancestor being in a federal court case are even less than being in a county court case or a state court case. But nonetheless, you can still find fabulous things in there. Your ancestor borrowed money or store goods from a business in another state, they're going to sue him in federal court because it crosses state lines. Your ancestor was robbing the mail or bootlegging or committing other federal crimes, they will show up. I mean, my family was in the micro distilling business. We were not in the let's get a license from the federal government for our distilling business. And we have some of the most amazing court case files at the National Archives at Atlanta. I mean, this stuff should be on HBO. Okay, they also have there the originals of the draft records. Ancestry has all the open draft records, but I think it's 1956, or maybe it's 1976, I'm not sure. It's just before I registered for the draft, or maybe not. Anyway, all the draft records that the public is allowed to see are on Ancestry.com, but there is a cutoff date for draft records after that. And you can still see those draft records if it's your draft record. But anybody else, no. But anyway, they're at the National Archives at Atlanta, and you can, if you can prove who you are, they'll bring out your draft record. I registered for the draft the day before Richard Nixon canceled the draft. And I don't care how you feel about President Nixon, he will always have a warm place in my heart. Okay, moving right along. All right, the Deep South was involved in many wars through 1848. The Indian Wars, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, et cetera, et cetera. All these military campaigns. Thousands and thousands of Alabamians served in these campaigns. We have a program coming up on military records. You don't want to miss that. But for the South, military records are particularly good because Southerners volunteered for wars all the time to make some money, to get away from the house for a while, to have an adventure, if you would. But thousands and thousands, and many of the records they left behind are of tremendous genealogical value. And we'll talk about that in our military records program. Okay, as this goes. Native American records are highly specific. They often cross state lines, and they should be searched by every old Southern family, black or white. Even if you're one of the few lucky Southerners who does not have a family story that grandma was a Cherokee princess in a I always think of Pocahontas in a Corvette when I hear that. But that your grandmother was a Cherokee princess or something. Nonetheless, even if you've never had a story like that, it's worth checking these records because you find a tremendous amount of stuff on non-Indian families somehow or another connected to all of this. For example, we have a handout at Wallace on the Tankersley family, and I won't go into all of that, but it's an excellent example of what Native American records can tell you. But one of the most valuable pieces of information is the family never knew who Tankersley was. But in the Cherokee Indian record, their Indian comes from their mother. But in the Oklahoma records, Cherokee records, on the application, one of the Tankersley said, "My father was James Tankersley." And for the Tankersley family, that just opened all sorts of doors. Now, we're not going to go into Native American records any more than I just have, because for the very reasons I just gave. But a copy of our major Indian handout is included in the packet with you, so you can see what we have for that. African American research sources are specific and also often cross state lines. And because I try not to get too specific with the records, we won't be covering them. But our Wallace State African American handout is in the packet that you've got as well. We've got on that. Okay, the Confederate States of America, all 11 of them, plus the states of Kentucky, Missouri, and Oklahoma, have state pension records, Civil War service records, Reconstruction records, voter list, etc., black and white, and these can be very rich in genealogical information. See, for example, the article that I did in Alabama Heritage a year or two back on Alabama's black African-American soldiers in the Civil War on that. But anyway, these records can be very valuable. And as I say, next week, I'm giving a talk on Civil War records on Wednesday and Thursday nights at Wallace State. Okay, Brent Holcomb. Now, Brent Holcomb has published hundreds of books, mostly on South Carolina, and they are fabulous books. But for the whole South, he published Marriages and Deaths from the Southern Christian Advocate. Methodist research is even harder than Baptist research. And if you've done Baptist research, you just can't imagine how that's possible. But it is. One of the greatest sources for your Methodist ancestors is the Southern Christian Advocate, because it covered the entire South until the 1870s. And the question that begs is what happens after the 1870s? After the 1870s, every state had its own Methodist newspaper. And as far as I know, nobody scanned or published those, although I certainly wish they would. All right, now let's do our state-by-state survey. And as we love to say in Georgia, let's move faster than Sherman to the sea. Okay. All right, Delaware, the District of Columbia, and Maryland. Almost all old Southern families, black and white, have ties to Delaware and Maryland. Trouble of it is you may have to dig through 200 years of genealogy before you find your Delaware ancestor or your Maryland ancestor. Okay, now there are a lot of myths about these three areas. Let me dispel the major ones. First off, most of the settlers in Delaware were English. They were not Swedes and they were not Finns, although I'm sure everybody in this room has at least one Finnish ancestor who settled in Delaware. The Finns loved Delaware and they loved America, and they still kept coming in waves through Delaware as late as the 1820s. Okay, there's a legend that Maryland was a Roman Catholic colony. It was not. Most of the settlers in Maryland were Protestants. However, if you were Roman Catholic, no one was going to persecute you in Maryland. Maryland has some wonderful Roman Catholic records, many of which have been published, but most of the Maryland families, as I say, were Protestant. They were Protestant. Delaware has never had a courthouse fire, but considering it only has 4 courthouses, that's not a big achievement. Okay. Maryland has only had two courthouse fires, which, considering there's only like 13 counties in Maryland, again, not this great achievement. But it's wonderful that the records have survived. Maryland and Delaware both have an excellent Hall of Records. I'm very fond of the Hall of Records in Maryland, or the Maryland Archives, as it's sometimes called. Got somebody with you, you've got a dump for the day? Send them down to see the Naval Academy down the street. Annapolis is a wonderful place to visit, some of the best seafood you'll ever eat. Send them out for that while you're at the Maryland Hall of Records. Only complaint I have about it is the building is way too small. Way too small, particularly for having such great records. All right, okay. Now, there are books published on the District of Columbia, and local records for the District of Columbia have been published. The myth goes that all the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. records were lost or were destroyed. No, they've got every scrap of paper they ever had. Thing of it is, for most of its history, it was ruled by the federal government, so their local government records are at the National Archives, not at the county courthouse. There are excellent books on doing research in the District of Columbia and excellent abstracts of the records from the District of Columbia. We have these books at Wallace. They are also at the Birmingham Public Library. Okay, much of the early records of Delaware and Maryland have been published. We have many of these books at Wallace State. What we do not have, the Birmingham Public Library does. But these books can be a bit complicated sometimes, but you'll find a way if you find your ancestor in the index. Okay, now, while you're in Washington, D.C., I should also mention it is the home of the National Archives and Records Administration, the Library of Congress, and the DAR Library. Each of these fabulous nationwide research centers has a really good book on how to do research there. So be sure to do that. Read the book before you go. Before you go. All right, let's talk about Virginia now. When you enter Virginia, they have this wonderful billboards, and they say, if you were born and raised in Virginia, if you call Virginia home, if you were just born in Virginia, if you've lived in Virginia, welcome home, Virginian. I think that is this. Oh, and also, if you had family that lived in Virginia, which is the only one I qualify for. But nonetheless, welcome home, Virginians. Anyway, Virginia and the United States Virginia began at Jamestown. Jamestown has grown a lot since 1607, and they changed the name of it. Today we call it the United States of America. Everything this country is, for better or worse, begins at Jamestown. Okay, now, near Jamestown, and this is worth taking some research time off to see this, aside from Jamestown, which has been reconstructed, you can also visit Colonial Williamsburg and Yorktown, where the American War for Independence came to an end. These are all within a few miles of each other. And on your way to Richmond, you can stop off and visit the James River plantations, which are well worth a visit as well. All right, the settlement in Virginia followed the rivers. And the reason is Virginia has wonderful rivers. And they would grow tobacco and wheat and other things, and they would float them down the rivers to Norfolk, to Hampton Roads, to the Chesapeake, from which they would then be sold to the world. Now, the rivers also played a big role in African American research. When you look at the records from the Civil War and the 1870 census and on, the oldest African Americans are always born in Virginia, and the youngest are always born in whatever state you're reading the census from. And that is, long before the Civil War, the only thing they were producing of value on the Virginia plantations were slaves. And the slaves were being sold south to Huntsville. And then from Huntsville, they will later be sold to Louisiana and Texas. It's from this we get two expressions in the English language, that you're being sold south or you're being sold down the river. That's where it comes from. All right, okay. Virginia's great centers for genealogical research are both in Richmond, although they're several miles apart. The first is the Virginia State Library and Archives, which is a fabulous research center with a very, very helpful staff and just a great place to do research on Virginia. Then they can answer your question. They have private manuscript collections, copies of government records, original government records, on and on. Another great place for research, although you'll want to check their catalog online first, is Special Collections of the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. That is one of the most fantastic special collections departments of any university in this country. And of course, if you need to dump someone, they can always go up the hill to the master of the mountain, to Monticello, and you can meet them for lunch at Gadsby's, the tavern at the foot of Monticello. But a lot to see and do in Charlottesville. Charlottesville is worth making a research trip just for the scenery getting there and back. And it's not that far from Richmond, about 90 miles. All right, many books have been published that document European immigration to Virginia. And this goes back a long ways. Once upon a time, it was almost impossible to do your family history beyond family stories unless they were you lived in New England or you lived in Virginia, and your family had not moved very far from where they first came ashore. Okay, and in those years, there was a huge industry before the Great Depression in genealogical books on Virginia, in anything and everything in Virginia. Unfortunately, some of these books do not have indexes, and you could spend all day going through them. Great resource for that. Great resource for that. Philby and Mayer's, the passenger and immigration list books, they went through all those dirty old books, and they put all the names in their big series of index books. So you go to Philby and Meyer, and they will lead you to the book and the page you need that shows your ancestor coming to Virginia in 1660. Or in 1778, your ancestor being listed as foreign born or something of that sort. All right, for other records of first arrivals from Virginia from Europe, also see the series Cavaliers and Pioneers and the series Adventurers of Person, which are very carefully compiled histories of these families. Now, Cavaliers and Pioneers is interesting. You're a Virginia planter, and you will get free land from the Commonwealth of Virginia for every human being that you bring into Virginia. When it becomes time for you to claim that land, you had to list all of these people. And they're published in Cavaliers and Pioneers. And for millions and millions of Americans, this is the first record of of a family member being in America when they were servants. All right, Virginia records have a lot of problems. Now, for the next hour or so, I'm going to extol to you all these wonderful records that other states have, but I'm not going to lie to you about Virginia. Virginia records are pathetic. It is really hard to do. It is good that we've had so many people working on so many families for such a long time in Virginia. Virginia does not have federal census records before 1810. Although it has almost complete tax records from 1782 to the present, most of the time when those tax records are published, they are published for a specific county. Often a county that otherwise has lost its records, like Buckingham County, for example. Brunswick County, I beg your pardon. Okay, anyway, in 1787, the state of Virginia took a census. And the 1787 census, which survives and has been published, is wonderful for another reason. Aside from the fact it covers Virginia, it also includes what will become Kentucky and what will become West Virginia, all in the 1787 census. Problem with that is most of our Virginia ancestors left Virginia before 1785, and arrived in Kentucky after 1790. So most of us, our ancestors, are literally missed coming and going. All right, let's see. Now, Virginia had several important early genealogical journals, just chock full of wonderful records. Some of the records that were published, those early genealogical journals, nobody knows what happened to them. A lot of great family information in those early Virginia journals. E.G. Swim, S-W-E-M, he published the Virginia Historical Index, which is a monster index to the early Virginia historical and genealogical journals. It is a gold mine of information. Now, we have every big library with a Virginia collection has a copy of Swim. At Wallace State, we have all the journals that are covered on microfilm. The Birmingham Public Library actually has the journals in paper, and I prefer to work with the paper copies than microfilm or scanned copies or anything. You just go to Swim's index, it tells you which periodical, which year, which page, etc. And then you go in the periodical room at the Birmingham Public Library and you just pull the periodicals off the shelf. All right, the more recent Virginia genealogical periodicals are excellent and very well indexed. These include Virginia Genealogist, the Magazine of Virginia Genealogy, and Southside Virginian. Okay, now, what is really cool about these periodicals? The editors raked and scraped and pulled together every record they could lay their hands on that shows where a Virginian moved to. And in African American research, if you know who owned the family, you can trace him to where they came from in Virginia. Okay, as this is. All right, anyway, as this goes. Unfortunately, many genealogies were written about Virginia families before 1960, and I think before 1960, the very idea of putting documentation in a genealogy was considered a sin. So you have to watch out for these old Virginia genealogies. They can be a lot of good information. They can also be a lot of mistakes. There can be a lot of omissions from them. And there was a series of books done by a man named Mardi. Watch out for those books. That man would publish anything anybody told him without ever asking for evidence on that. All right, Virginia local government records genuinely are horrible until about 1858. Starting in 1858, Virginia has civil registrations of marriages. Before that, they had marriage bonds. And there are all sorts of reasons your ancestors' marriage bond has not survived. Estate records were pathetic. But you're really doing well in the old Virginia records if you can pull information out of them as that goes. There are excellent indexes published by region of Virginia that index the estate records that have survived. The first of these is by Clayton Torrance, and it covers all of Virginia to 1800. At the Virginia State Library and Archives, they have a copy of Clayton Torrance's book where someone has penciled in all the mistakes and all the estate records he missed into that book. Also, they've got a card catalog of estate records that were found that were from burned counties. Virginia has had many counties that have been destroyed, all the records have been destroyed. And the records were not that great to begin with. But anyway, there are published indexes to the estate records to 1865. Okay, understanding Virginia requires you to understand county boundary changes. Now, first off, my friend, the late Robert Clay, I often would hear him telling people, do not attempt Virginia research unless you know where in Virginia your ancestor came from. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. And if you come to the Virginia archives with that attitude, you may end up wasting my time, he said. But there are things like Revolutionary War pension claims and some records we'll be talking about in our military session that can be a big help in locating where in Virginia your family came from. Also, Virginia genealogists and these other periodicals and the 1787 census, they can all be a big help in locating where in Virginia your family came from. But when you find out that county, then learn everything you can about how that county was created and what was created from that county. Because Virginia county boundaries were like an amoeba or something. They were always contracting and expanding and all of that good stuff. All right, Carol McGinnis has done a great book called Virginia Genealogy, Sources and Resources. And if you want to look at West Virginia, there's Helen S. Stinson's West Virginia History, a bibliography and guide to research. All right, let's talk about North Carolina, or Poor Carolina, as it was called, Poor Carolina. Poor Carolina has horrible harbors. The closest thing to a harbor that it has is called Cape Fear, the graveyard of ships. That should tell you something. North Carolina has shallow rivers. For all of these reasons, North Carolina was always one of the poorest states in America. There is so little good soil in Virginia and North Carolina, and so much of that good soil was taken by the wealthy very early on, that North Carolina settled much of the rest of the South. People just moved on looking for more opportunities. North Carolina was the New Jersey of the South. New Jersey was also, and Maine were also places people were always leaving. You were always from these places. You were never moving to them, if you would. All right. Now, North and South Carolina were once one colony, and they were awarded to the 8 Lords Proprietors by King Charles because he could not pay them the money that he owed them. I'm sure they would have preferred the money, but they ended up with Carolina. Basically, a line was drawn across Virginia, and King Charles said that everything south of this line to the South Pole will be your colony. They named the colony after him. The Latin feminine is Carolina. Okay, Carolina was too big to control, so the Lords Proprietors split it into North and South Carolina in 1719. Okay, it passed from the Lords Proprietors to the King in 1729. However, the boundary between North and South Carolina was not settled until the 1820s. And I have no doubt there were people who lived right around that boundary who never had a clue as to whether they were in North Carolina or South Carolina. That is very possible. Okay, now, North Carolina, colonial North Carolina had Lords Proprietors land grants. They had Granville land grants. They had Royal land grants. Margaret Hoffman has published lists of all of these grants. And these are available at major libraries like mine and the Birmingham Public Library. And these are a huge help in finding out where your ancestor lived. In my library at Wallace State, we also have the state land grants and the colonial land grants on microfilm and the estate packets for helping you find even more information on your North Carolina ancestor. All North Carolina land grant records, including the first land grants for what will become Tennessee, are at the North Carolina Archives in Raleigh. All of the land grant records are there. Okay. The North Carolina State Archives, and I should also mention the State Archives of Massachusetts and Missouri, respectively. The North Carolina State Archives has a law, and the law says that any records in your courthouse that you do not need for day-to-day operations must be turned over to the State Archives. So you go to the State Archives at Raleigh, You may use microfilm records, but more likely you're going to be there using the original records. They will haul them out to you. And I can tell you there's no feeling in this world like when you're holding the original, not a copy, of the 1773 will of your ancestor with his signature on it. And you're just shaking, holding this thing. Anyway, a lot of really good books have been published of North Carolina records that have been taken from these local loose records that have been turned over to the state archives. A lot of really good stuff. All right. North Carolina records, unlike Virginia, North Carolina records are rich in information. And they are the kind of records you and I are familiar with, and so that helps as well. All right. At the end of the American Revolution, everybody in North Carolina was owed money by the state of North Carolina, and the state treasurer went from tavern to tavern, writing out IOUs to everyone who came forward and made a claim. These are called the North Carolina Revolutionary War accounts and vouchers. The originals are at the North Carolina Archives. We have a microfilm copy at Wallace. Now, they're very well indexed and they're very easy to use, but here's the real kicker in the deck. Yes, this will get you into the DAR, because there's thousands of Revolutionary War service in those accounts where they're not documented anywhere else. Yes, that will get you into the DAR. Okay, that's all well and good, but the thing of it is, so many people made claims that this is like a census of North Carolina during the Revolution and a census of North Carolina after the Revolution, when everybody's lining up to get their IOUs. All right. Okay. North Carolina has federal census records starting in 1790, but as late as, except for the 1890 federal census, except as late as 1820, some counties are missing. And in North Carolina research, it's entirely too easy to forget which counties are missing from a specific census. You have to keep an eye on that. All right, the North Carolina State Archives has an excellent online index to many thousands of its records. Now, the dream of the North Carolina Archives is to fully index, and I mean fully index, I mean even by subject, every single record in their state archives. And they've come a long ways towards doing it. So before you go looking for manuscripts or something, before you set out on your trip to Raleigh, go online, check your index for the people you're looking for, and you could be very pleasantly surprised. You could be very pleasantly surprised. Okay. All right, now we're going to share some secrets of North Carolina research. We're going to share some secrets. And we're going to share these secrets because I know you won't tell anybody, or any of you at home. All right, very good. There is a wonderful book called North Carolina Genealogical Research. It's about that thick, but fortunately it's in large print, and it is a wonderful book. Experts on North Carolina research wrote the chapters, and they give you blow-by-blow detailed names, well, not names, but they give you dates and the records, and they explain everything, every kind of record you would find in North Carolina. Tax records, court records, military records, Indian records, African American records, maps of all types. Now, the book is a bit dated. It was before the internet age, but it's still a fabulous book. But it's important that you read this book before you try to understand North Carolina records. Okay, North Carolina has many valuable local genealogical journals. And the North Carolina State Library in Raleigh is a great place to look at these. And we have some of them at the Birmingham Public Library. Okay, now, one of the nation's very best state genealogical journals is the North Carolina Genealogical Society Journal. It is super. And there's a complete run of it. It's very well indexed. A complete run of it is at the Birmingham Public Library. And, again, like Virginia, They have always been hunting for any record that shows where somebody used to live in North Carolina, something that ties your family in Burke County, Georgia, to Wake County, North Carolina, somebody that ties your Madison County, Alabama family to a family in Anson County, North Carolina. And anyway, their state journal is excellent, and they have many excellent local journals too. Almost all of which, by the way, are indexed, and those few that are not indexed, it doesn't take you long to go through the table of contents. All right, the North Carolina State Archives and the North Carolina State Library are in the same building on East Jones Street in Raleigh, within easy walking distance of a motel. And now, when I used to take groups on research trips to North Carolina, I always took the group first to the North Carolina Archives and gave them a tour. The staff told me to give the tours since I knew more about their archives than they did. But that's because they're always changing personnel, and that's one of the reasons they stay. The personnel are so wonderfully helpful, and et cetera. All right. Anyway, if I had taken the group to the North Carolina State Library first, they would have refused to go to the archives. They have so much good stuff there. They have an excellent genealogical library for North Carolina and all the states that border North Carolina, excellent family histories. They have family folders that will knock your socks off. It's just an amazing place. The only complaint I or anyone else has about it is that it's entirely too small. I mean, I have worked there all day when I never had a place to sit down. But nonetheless, it's a great place to do research. Both of them are. Okay, the North Carolina Archives also has regional archives. It has a regional archives in Asheville, which is the mountains, and in Montejo, which is on the coast. All right, records survive for specific groups of Tar Heels. The Moravians in Winston-Salem, visit Old Salem. It's just out of this world, out of this world. The Moravians have rebuilt their colonial town, and they have the best sugar cookies you'll ever eat. And it's also the home to the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. But they have a Moravian archives there, and someone who reads Old High German. So if you're there researching your Moravian ancestors, they have an archives there for you, and the Moravians kept wonderful records. All right, the North Carolina Quaker records have been published to a certain degree, and their archives is Guilford College in Guilford, North Carolina, or better known as Guilford Courthouse in Guilford, North Carolina. Now, Mrs. McCubbin, for something like 60 years, she did research in Rowan County, North Carolina. Her research also extended into Iredell and Orange County, and she also did research for clients. Her research files are absolutely massive, but they are very well indexed and very easy to use. A microfilm copy of the McCubbin Collection is at the Huntsville Public Library. The Huntsville Public Library has a microfilm copy of it. However, the North Carolina State Library has a better index to it. And the originals of the McCubbin Collection, including modern editions, are in the Salisbury Public Library in Rowan County, North Carolina. Okay, I know at this point you think I'm exaggerating about North Carolina. I make North Carolina sound like such a wonderful place to do research with all these wonderful records. You almost wish you could have more North Carolina families to research. Well, I'm not done yet. Not really. Within 30 minutes of the North Carolina State Archives are the South's two greatest manuscript repositories. The first is the Southern Historical Collection at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the Wilson Library, and it is spectacular. You go to the manuscripts, the Southern Historical Collection, in an elevator that is larger than the motel room you'll be sleeping in that night. It is done in brass and mirrors. The doors open. You step out. You sink 2 inches into the plush carpet. You go up to the nice young work-study student and you tell her what you're there for. And she shows you how to look at their extensively indexed and abstracted collections. And then you ask the nice man behind the counter, who you think is probably a town drunk working part-time or whatever, for the records, and he goes and gets them. He later turns out to be the director. Okay. You sit in this wonderful chair that you wish you could take home with you at this table, and you bring out the records. And you say, there's so much good stuff here, and I only got this afternoon, and I can't copy. And the nice young lady says, they're there for a very reasonable fee. We will scan everything you want. Just put a tab on it and point to it or something, and I will set it aside and we'll copy it for you. But if you absolutely must have a copy, there's a copy machine there in the corner. Just come see me when you're leaving, and we'll add it up. It is a wonderful place to do research. Also, 20 minutes from the North Carolina State Archives, depending on traffic, is the Perkins Library of Duke University, which is the South's second largest great manuscript repository. Now, unfortunately, most of their materials are not on the Duke campus, so you need to find what you want a week before you come to Duke. Order it, tell them what day you're going to be there, and they will have the manuscripts for you. If you find something after you are there, they will pull it for you the next day if you can come back the next day. But the Perkins Library at Duke University. Okay. All right. Tennessee. Tennessee was cut from the western lands of North Carolina in 1790, and it became the state of Tennessee in 1796. This explains all these awful license plates that said Bicentennial back in 1996. All right, Tennessee is the 3 states in one, as they proudly proclaim. And this is actually carved in marble at the Tennessee State Library and Archives. But there is West Tennessee with Memphis and its great library, Genealogical Library, that also includes the adjoining areas. There's Middle Tennessee, which has the great state archives in Nashville. Did I mention that the Tennessee State Library and Archives in Nashville is my favorite state archives? And also Chattanooga, which has a Chattanooga Hamilton County Bicentennial Public Library. And then in East Tennessee, we have the Mcclellan Collection in Knoxville. Mcclellan Collection in Knoxville. All right, the Tennessee State Archives and State Library are 2 separate institutions that occupy the same space in the same building. It's very confusing, so don't try to think about it. But they're all very nice people. The manuscript, everything there is extremely well organized. People used to ask me, how do you best spend your time at the Tennessee Archives? The answer is, you come through the door, you take a right, you walk all the way around the library, stopping at every card catalog, everything that looks interesting, and then you end up back at the beginning. That's a very successful research strategy for there. They're rarer books they keep in closed stacks, but they will get them for you almost instantly. Back in the day, they had a lot of employees, but they didn't have a lot to do. So what they did was they did these wonderful card catalogs to their resources, to Tennessee places, Tennessee people, Tennessee biographical sketches. They have these monster old genealogical collection books, and they have it indexed by family to those. And those card catalogs are wonderful, wonderful. All right, Tennessee's federal census records began in 1830, except for Middle Tennessee. Middle Tennessee has the 1820 census also. There's been a huge effort made to scratch up, index, abstract, whatever Tennessee records they could before 1830, and to publish them either by, need I say it, East Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, and West Tennessee, or by the whole state. newspaper abstracts, marriages, tax records, estate records, military records. All big genealogical libraries like Birmingham Public and my collection have these wonderful Tennessee books to help you find where your ancestor would have been. You would have found them if the census records had survived for your ancestor. And Tennessee has the most wonderful books, which are also pretty good because they're well indexed too. All right, Tennessee has not had that many courthouse fires. They've had relatively few. And their records are modeled after those of North Carolina, which goes on to, which is another way of saying they are excellent research information sources full of all sorts of good stuff as this goes. All right. Now, a real secret about the Tennessee Archives, and I really shouldn't be telling you this. If you get up early and you arrive at the archives before it opens, you can park right in front of the archives, and they will give you, as your prize for getting there so early, a piece of paper you can put in your window where you can park in front of the archives all day long, and nobody will bother you or charge you or anything. And it's worth getting up early for, believe me. Okay, now, moving right along here. Okay, and by the way, when you're at the Tennessee State Library and Archives, if you've got somebody to dump, Nashville is like London. When you're tired of Nashville, you're tired of life. I mean, there's ample things to do in Nashville. And you can also go out of town and visit the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's home. Spectacular place. All right, let's talk about some of these other libraries real quick here. Believe it or not, the McClellan brothers were from Huntsville, Alabama. But they made their fortunes in Knoxville, and one of the brothers gave his fortune to create the fabulous Knoxville Art Museum. The other gave his money to the East Tennessee Historical Society to create a genealogical library. And this library is spectacular. It is spectacular. And it not only covers East Tennessee, but Southwest Virginia and Western North Carolina. It is open 7 days a week. And since it's ran by the East Tennessee Historical Society, it has the East Tennessee Historical Museum, which will help you get in touch with your inner hillbilly. And that, I might add, other than the art museum, is the only other thing I would see in Knoxville. But anyway, you will wish, when you are there and you see their fabulous manuscript collections and their books and their microfilm and the rest of it, you'll wish everywhere had a McClellan collection. Now, one important thing about the McClellan collection, a lot of East Tennesseans have spent years and years and years doing research there. And when they died, their families donated their papers to the East Tennessee Historical Society. So the McClellan collection not only has fabulous family folders, they have entire collections for major families of that region. Okay, go about an hour and a half west from Knoxville, and you come to Chattanooga. Chattanooga Hamilton County Bicentennial Library has wonderful newspaper clippings, wonderful family folders. They've put together a lot of resources on deaths and obituaries and things like that for Chattanooga. Also, the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga has a wonderful manuscripts department, as does the University of Tennessee in Knoxville as well. Just don't get the two confused. And again, if you've got somebody with you who doesn't want to do research, they can go to Rock City, they can go to the aquarium, they can, as Johnny Cash sings, most any old night, you can go down and see Ruby Fall. That's a joke. Okay, go and see Ruby Fall. Okay, anyway, Memphis, and of course Memphis, we don't need to talk about Memphis. Everybody should see Memphis at least once in their life. Okay, the Memphis Public Library collects everything on West Tennessee, on eastern Arkansas, and on northern Mississippi, unless it pertains to Elvis Presley. Now, they've got nothing against the king. The only thing is there's just so much of it that they gave up trying to collect it. But fabulous family folders and books, fabulous finding aids, Memphis Public Library. Great place to do research. Okay. And we talked about Tennessee's records. All right, South Carolina. All right, South Carolina's colonial records were all kept in Charleston, which is why they've all survived. And they are today at the South Carolina Archives, the South Carolina Department of Archives and History in Colombia. Many of these colonial records of South Carolina have been published, including deeds, jury lists, military records, minutes of the governor and council, newspapers, etc. The South Carolina Department of Archives and History has an online index to its state and colonial land grant records, and that index is spectacular. And that is, as they say, to the their online index, which indexes all of South Carolina's land grant records. South Carolina's frontier ended in 1784, and South Carolina adopted a very conservative government, particularly with regards to records. There was no civil registration of marriages until 1911. All right, you will have to probate a relative's estate records in South Carolina in the old days. You got up all of your paperwork, you took it to the courthouse, and they took your paperwork away from you and filed it. They didn't even bother recording it. They didn't even call their governments counties, they called them districts. I think the idea was that every year they were going to change the districts or something. It's not until 1868 the districts are even called counties, which they were. But anyway, you'll find South Carolina records. On the one hand, they seem terribly disappointing because they don't have civil marriage registration. They don't have a lot of recorded records. But on the other hand, they are spectacular. In libraries like this one in the Birmingham Public Library, and my library, you see all these wonderful books of South Carolina marriage records. And you say, now wait a minute, they didn't have marriage records until 1911. What's in these books? People have gone through those estate packets and they pulled out the marriages that are implied in the estate records. And this will not only be an important clue to you as to who the bride is, but sometimes who the bride's father was, because in his estate records it says that he died, and among his heirs is his son-in-law who married his daughter so-and-so. And if you have some success with that, you wish every state had something like that where they went through the the estate records and pulled the marriages from it. Okay, but again, to give you some idea what South Carolina records are like, South Carolina does not have Confederate pension applications until 1915. Before that, they just handed out money at the courthouse to everybody who swore they were a Confederate veteran or widow. I'm not making this up, honest. Okay, now in addition to the state archives in Columbia, South Carolina has some great research centers. The South Caroliniana Library of the University of South Carolina in Columbia is the greatest collection of South Caroliniana material that has ever been or ever will be. It has the most complete collection of printed materials on South Carolina. It has the greatest manuscripts collections for South Carolina, including entire collections of extensive genealogical research. And you can check their catalog online for that. They have the most complete collection of South Carolina newspapers found anywhere. This is in Columbia, but it's quite some distance from the state archives. Other great places for doing research in South Carolina. The Camden Archives. And Camden is an amazing place to visit. Camden really is. Because this is one of the few counties in this country that every year has far more money than they can spend. And it's shown in Camden in every way. One of the things they spend it on is an archive dedicated to the families of Camden and Charlottesville, South Carolina. And it's about 30 minutes from Columbia. Orangeburg, in the 1870s, federal soldiers destroyed the courthouse in Orangeburg, and they destroyed the town cemetery. So the people of Orangeburg have built the Orangeburg Archives on top of the town cemetery. I mean, why not? Anyway, it is dedicated to pulling together all the information that can now be salvaged on the Orangeburg families. And it is a great place to do research, extensive files. And fortunately, the people of Orangeburg recognized the problem they were having from a very early on. And so a lot of good information was published when there were still people alive who knew it on Orangeburg. And then in Charleston, there is the South Carolina Historical Society. South Carolina Historical Society. South Carolina's oldest archives, fabulous manuscript collections, genealogical materials, fabulous publications. There was a time when they actually went out and microfiched the private manuscript collections of smaller archives and libraries just to have preserve a copy in their archives and library. And of course, Charleston's a fabulous place to visit on that. Fabulous place to visit. But if you're in Charleston, do what almost nobody else ever does. Visit the Museum of Charleston. This is the greatest grandma's attic the world has ever known. I mean, this place is absolutely crammed with stuff, and they don't even have half their holdings out on the floors. But anyway, be sure to visit the Museum of Charleston while you are there. And if you're there on a weekend, you can visit the Hundley Confederate submarine. All right, the Leonardo Andrea collection. Leonardo Andrea was a newspaper man in Charleston and Columbia, South Carolina, and in his spare time he did genealogical research for people. He compiled massive files on 800 South Carolina families. And this is today at the South Caroliniana Library, but it's also widely available on microfilm. It is on microfilm at the Huntsville Public Library, the Leonardo Andrea collection. One big drawback, the material is arranged by the last name of his client. So sometimes you have to work a bit with this. You have to work a bit with this. All right, Understanding South Carolina Records. I recommend Brent Holcomb's book, A Guide to South Carolina Genealogical Research. And I also recommend his very well-indexed statewide periodical, the South Carolina Magazine of Ancestral Research. All right, Richard Cote. Richard Cote did 5 books on South Carolina, and they're all really good books. His local and family history in South Carolina includes a list of the files in the Andrea collection, a huge bibliography of family histories in South Carolina and the libraries that hold them, and lots of other good things. But Richard Cote's local and family history in South Carolina. He also did a book called The Dictionary of South Carolina Biography. And what he did was he went through all sorts of sources in South Carolina, and wherever there was a biographical sketch published of a South Carolinian, he listed in this book. Now this includes the South Carolina legislature, which paid to have biographical books compiled on everyone who had ever served in the South Carolina legislature. And the family information just found in those biographical sketches is staggering. It is staggering. All right, with that. All right, Georgia is a wonderful land of myth. And by the way, honest disclosure here, I am a Georgian through and through. And as the old saying goes, when you're a Georgian, you're Georgian as hell. It's kind of like the old joke about being pregnant. You're either are or not. You're either a Georgian or you're not, and I'm a Georgian. So if I seem to gleam a little bit about this and such, well, that's what we do. All right, Georgia's a land of myth, and in fact, you could build a pretty good history about what people believe about Georgia that is not true and what is argued about. Georgia was founded as a second chance for English debtors in 1733. In colonial Georgia, the only courthouse was in Savannah, and that's why almost all of Georgia's colonial records survive. Almost all of Georgia's colonial records survive. And most of them have been published or indexed. Now, I did not include in your packet a handout I have on colonial Georgia. If you'll send me an email, I'll send you my colonial Georgia handout that explains where all this stuff is published or indexed. Georgia was one of the 13 colonies that formed the United States during the American Revolution. With some notable exceptions, Georgia was settled from east to west. Now, the families who lived in Savannah, they didn't get out very far. Like an old friend of mine said, if he wanted to do his family tree, he'd go down to Bonaventure Cemetery. He said his whole family's laid out there in everything except genealogical chart order. And by the way, he's lying there now himself. Okay, but anyway, Georgia was settled from east to west. Okay, the eastern lands were granted as head right and Revolutionary War military bounty grants. And there's a big, thick book that's called Index to Head Right and Bounty Land Grants of Georgia. It's described in one of your handouts. And that is a pretty good census substitute for Georgia from 1783 to 1796, because just about every free white family got a land grant in that period. The other 4/5 of Georgia was settled by a series of land lotteries. And the land lottery books are wonderful people finders, and they're a great source of information, and they're also described in a handout that I've given you there. Okay. Now, Georgia does not have a 1790, an 1800, or an 1810 federal census. Our 1820 census is so bad we almost wish it didn't survive. Okay. The 1820 census is also missing Franklin, Rabun, and Twiggs counties on that. Okay, in 1790, 40% of Georgia, black and white, lived in just one Georgia county. This was original Wilkes County, Georgia. That's the good news. The better news is Wilkes County has almost every scrap of paper it ever had, including its tax digest. And most of this stuff, at least for the early years, when your family lived in Wilkes County, have been published or indexed or whatever. I'm doing another Wilkes County book right now that is pretty much scraping the bottom of the barrel for Wilkes County material to publish. Okay, so as they say, the Wilkes County records also serve as a census substitute, just like the land lottery records do. Okay, Georgia has had 159 counties. 32 of that 159, Georgia has 159 counties. 32 of those counties were original counties that we just hacked out of the woods. They don't have ancestor counties. They were just a place in the woods. We all gathered around a tree by a spring. We held court, and the county seat was born, if you would. Georgia did have 161 counties, but Campbell and Milton counties were in 1932 were gobbled up by Fulton County. Okay, now that's bad enough. Georgia has more counties than any state except Texas, and Texas is 2.5 times bigger than we are. Now, the reason for this was, the myth goes it's so we could get to the courthouse. No, it had nothing to do with that. We had all these railroads after the Civil War, and every whistle stop wanted to be a county seat so they could make big bucks, and so that's how we ended up with so many counties. Mercifully, the Georgia legislature did not let everybody have a county, or we would probably have more counties than Texas does. All right, now, as this goes. Now, here is something very complicated about Georgia, and a lot of things are very complicated about Georgia, but you need to know this. In over 30 instances, we have Georgia counties that have the same name as Georgia cities or towns, but those cities and towns are not in the county that bears the same name. Your grandmother always said, "We were from Macon, Georgia. We were from Macon, Georgia. We lived in Macon, Georgia for generations." You go to Bibb County in the city of Macon, you can't find hide nor hair of your family. You go to the federal census, they're in Macon County, Georgia, which is 100 miles from the city of Macon, Georgia. Forsyth is the county seat of Monroe County. The county seat of Forsyth County is coming. People ask me all the time, how are things in Jasper County? I have no idea. I'm from Pickens County, Georgia, whose county seat is Jasper, okay? And for the record, Jasper County's county seat is Monticello, which should be the name of the county seat of Jefferson County, which it's not. Louisville is, which, anyway, don't try to make sense of it. It makes no sense. But anyway, watch out for that. Watch out for that. All right, many Georgia counties, we've had many courthouse fires in Georgia. We've had over 100 courthouse fires in Georgia, but a lot of these courthouse fires, no records were lost, or very little records were lost. On the other hand, there's some counties, like Fulton County, where some records are missing because somebody threw them down a well, but the rest of the records survived. So that can be a bit of a problem. Now, your grandma said that your family came from the Atlanta area. Watch out for that. The Atlanta area is a circle 150 miles across with 5 points in Atlanta at the middle. Part of the Atlanta area is East Alabama. It is that big an area. You have a handout there on records on for research in the Atlanta area, which is almost like researching an entirely different state from Georgia. All right, Georgia has a vast number of records, but our records are very complicated. Many records have published indexes. Ted O'Brooke has published a gigantic index to the testors of wills in Georgia. In other words, it's a monster index to Georgia wills from 1733 to 1900. It's huge. And it is wonderful. To understand Georgia records, just how vast they are and how complicated they can be, see Ted O'Brooke's book, Georgia Research. Read the second edition of Georgia Research. Okay. We talked about the federal census records. The Georgia Archives in Morrow has an almost complete set of Georgia tax records from 1872 to the present. From 1872 to the present. Wrap your mind around that. Now, a lot of people say, yeah, but I need them for before 1872. Wait a minute. You know Grandpa died sometime after the 1880 federal census. After the 1880 federal census, but we don't have the 1890 federal census. Okay, here's what you do. You pull out the tax records for that county starting in 1881, and you keep following them until Grandpa disappears. And there in his place is the name of his widow, and she's paying the taxes now. Now you know when Grandpa died. Or he abandoned them, or anyway, he's no longer in the picture. Also, Georgia, at various times, we taxed merry-go-round owners, photographers, doctors, lawyers, traveling peddlers, as this goes. We would ask you how many children you had of school age in your household, so the state would know how much money to allocate to each county for education the following year. These 1872 on tax records are a gold mine of information. Now, let me also throw out into this that Georgia has many tax records for counties like Wilkes and Clark and Jefferson and Baldwin. So many wonderful tax records earlier than 1872. And these serve with the land lottery records as census substitutes and supplements. And in fact, you have a handout that list all these wonderful records you can use to supplement and substitute for Georgia Census records. Okay, the only thing we Georgians love more than making records is making little Georgians. We have in Georgia more than 170 archives, libraries, and other records repositories. Go to the website of the Georgia Archives to get a list of them. It is absolutely staggering. Some of our libraries and archives are absolutely spectacular. The Atlanta History Center is a fabulous archive for Atlanta and all the surrounding counties and the whole Atlanta area. And while you're researching, the person with you can see the spectacular grounds of the Atlanta History Center, visit the cyclorama of the Battle of Atlanta, visit the Margaret Mitchell Museum and the Bobby Jones Museum and the 1920s Swan House, all this wonderful stuff. Oh, by the way, what can you do for tourism in Morrow, Georgia? I was raised there. There's nothing. Never has been, never will be, other than the Georgia Archives and the National Archives at Atlanta. In Macon, Georgia, which has a lot of great things to see, there is the Georgia Baptist Collection at Mercer University, absolutely fabulous. The Georgia Historical Society is in Savannah, and after remodeling and COVID and all the rest of it, it's reopened for business. And I'm going there at the end of the month. I've been waiting for years for it to reopen. All right, the Huxford Library is a wonderful library to do research in, although it's a little off the wall. Folks, Huxford was a county historian down in extreme South Georgia on the Georgia border, and he researched all the families south of Macon. That's what we call the Wiregrass in Georgia, the area south of Macon. After he died, his many fans created the Huxford Library in Homerville, Georgia. And you may want to know, where is Homerville? It is smack dab in the middle of the Okefenokee Swamp. By the way, you can email and find folks down there, and they will search their files and find you wonderful things on your Wiregrass family. Other great libraries, the Odom Library in Moultrie, Georgia, about an hour and a half from Macon. Fabulous resources. They have the papers of more than 100 family genealogical societies, more than 100 of these societies. Great place for doing research. And then there's yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, she's absolutely right. The Odom Library is also a great place for doing Scottish research, as is Wallace State, I might add. Okay, finally, the Washington Memorial Library in Macon. Washington Memorial Library in Macon. It is the greatest genealogical library in Georgia. It covers all 13 states and also Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, West Virginia, Kentucky, etc., and the original 13 states. Fabulous library, fabulous private collections and family folders. Again, the Washington Memorial Library in Macon, which you must understand is not in Washington County, which is county seat is Sandersville. It is not in the town of Washington, Georgia, which is the county seat of Wilkes County, but it's on Washington Avenue in Macon, Georgia, which is not in Macon County. It's in Bibb County. Now, in that short list I just gave you, I've only touched the iceberg, tips of the iceberg. Georgia has 159 counties. We have almost 159 public libraries. Every one of the public libraries has a heritage room. And many of these heritage rooms are absolutely spectacular. Your ancestor was in the Georgia Gold Rush. You must visit the Chestatee Regional Library in Dahlonega, Georgia. They have huge collections on the gold mines and the families who settled in Dahlonega. Your family comes from Gainesville, like my father's family. Visit the Hall County Public Library, which has original county records, the Sybil McRae Genealogical Collection. Northwest Georgia, we've got the Crown Garden Archives in Dalton. We've got the Sarah Hightower Library in Rome. And like I said, it's all over Georgia we have these fabulous libraries. Augusta Genealogical Society, great place to do research, and on and on. And I'm sure whatever counties your ancestors came from, they have great libraries with great search rooms in Georgia. And of course, that's just me promoting Georgia. And I will always promote Georgia. As we say in Georgia, tourist is worth more than a bale of cotton and is a whole lot easier to pick. Okay, all right. Millions of pages of Georgia newspapers have been digitized, and they are free online, and they are word searchable. And this is the Digital Library of Georgia newspapers. Digital Library of Georgia newspapers. And that is just absolutely wonderful. And Georgia newspapers are also well represented in many of the other newspaper sites. All right, let's talk quickly about Florida. Florida was first settled in 1565. In 1565, it was first abandoned in 1767, and it's been resettled and abandoned several times since. As a consequence of this, Florida has the most magnificent collection of censuses and census substitutes that have ever existed for anywhere, going back from Spanish Florida in 1784 right up to, I think, the 1905 federal census. You're saying there was a 1905 federal census? There was in Florida. These are kept at the Florida State Archives. Okay, the oldest European settlement in America is St. Augustine. And St. Augustine is a fabulous place to visit. The St. Augustine Historical Society and the University of North Florida in Jacksonville have fabulous resources for Northwest Florida, including for the Georgians and other Southern Protestants who settled in Spanish East Florida after 1784 and before the United States took it over in 1819. But now, Florida became part of the United States in 1819. Wars with the Seminoles are the longest in the United States history and cost more American lives than Vietnam did. Oh, and that 1818 to 1852, that's the Florida Indian Wars, not the war in Vietnam. Okay, as this is, Florida has a university special collections for each region of Florida. For Northeast Florida, it's the University of North Florida. For the Panhandle, it is the West Florida Archives at the University of West Florida. For Southern Florida, it's the University of Miami. You get where I'm going with this. And so they have a local archives for each region of Florida. Florida State Archives is in Tallahassee, which I might add is only a few miles away from a fabulous genealogical library in Thomasville, Georgia. Florida State Capitol is closer to its state line than any other state. And actually, Tallahassee is a suburb of Thomasville, Georgia. Wrap your mind around that idea. Okay, as this is. Okay, for the entire state of Florida, for research, there is a P.K. Young Library at the University of Florida at Gainesville. It is very easy to use. The collections, including the photographs, are very well organized. It is a dream to work there. But anyway, and Florida has had very few courthouse records, and the records are somewhat modeled after Georgia and North Carolina, so the records tend to be very information rich for however long your ancestor happened to have stayed in Florida. That's always the kicker in the deck. All right, let's talk about Mississippi Territory and State. All right, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, and Mississippi are federal land states. This means that the United States government granted the land. Okay, not the individual states. Now, the records of the federal land records are kept by the National Archives, or they are kept by the Bureau of Land Management. Both of them have excellent websites where you can access federal land records. The Bureau of Land Management has actually scanned federal land records onto their site for you. There are many good records. Now, in 1798, the United States carved out of the unorganized land south of the Ohio River the Mississippi Territory, which is today Mississippi and Alabama. There were tons of records that have been published on the Mississippi Territory, and they're all well indexed and they're all easily available. All of these records are at the Birmingham Public Library. They're also at Wallace State. And some of these records, like the papers of the territorial papers of the United States and the American state papers, are all on the internet for free at Hathi Trust. Dorothy Potter has done 2 editions of passports issued by governors of Georgia to people who were passing through the Indian country to Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. These records generally go up to about 1820. She's now preparing a 3rd edition, which will include more passports that somebody found for her. And modesty forbids me from mentioning it's me. Okay, Mississippi had Spanish censuses for 1784, 1787, 1788, 1794. The Mississippi Territory had several censuses between 1798 and 1817, and Mississippi had a state census in 1866 and has voter lists for 1866, 67 to 1868. Mississippi only has federal census records after 1830, and even then it doesn't have Pike County for 1830, it does not have 1890, and it does not have for 1860 Hancock, Sunflower, and Washington counties. The Mississippi Department of Archives and History is in Jackson, and a very good guide to its manuscript holdings is Ann S. Lipscomb's Tracing Your Mississippi Ancestors. I highly recommend that book. All right, let's talk now about Alabama, what you've been waiting for, Alabama. All right, European settlement of Alabama began by France in Mobile in 1702, 2 years before New Orleans was founded. That's why Mobile's Mardi Gras is older. Mobile has been ruled by France, Great Britain, Spain, the United States, and the Confederacy. Now, in Alabama, we have an old tradition. There are 2 groups of Alabamians, those who live in Mobile and those who don't. And most of us are those who don't, okay? In Mobile, if you turn your back on your family and your friends, you turn your back on your life, you forsake Mobile, that may simply mean that you just moved across the bay to Spanish Fort. Okay, they are that enclosed a society, if you would. But they have spectacular records. And if you're lucky enough to have had Mobile ancestors, Mobile is a gold mine. They have 5 major research libraries. And if you visit any one, I recommend starting with the Mobile Public Library. They have a pamphlet that shows you where the other 4 are. And in addition to that, they have all these wonderful museums that are also archives. My great-grandmother was a nurse here in Mobile, and she let being Mardi Gras Queen go to her head, and she moved to Huntsville. What can you help me with? Well, we can help you a great deal here at the Mobile Public Library, but before we forget, let's mention, by the way, that we have the Mardi Gras Museum, which has your grandmother's dress on display and all of her information on her reign as our Mardi Gras Queen. Oh, and by the way, you mentioned she was a nurse. We have a medical museum here in Mobile that also has a medical archives on all medical professionals who have operated in our fair city. And it's just staggering. You wish everywhere in Alabama could have records like Mobile. And to some degree, much of it does. Okay, this Alabama we all know and love today, that is for the rest of us not in Mobile, began in Washington County and in Madison County, what is today Huntsville, at pretty much the same time. Washington County is a weird situation. 1817, Mississippi Territory was split between Mississippi and Alabama. Washington County was split down the middle. Now, since that time, all these other counties have been created, and now the two Washington counties no longer adjoin each other. Washington, what they did not know is that when the counties split, they divided the records between them. So for years they were saying in Washington County, Alabama, we are missing many of our early records. Washington County, Mississippi, we are missing many of our early records. Someone found out what had happened and informed both counties as to where their missing records are. Modesty forbids me from telling you who. Okay, let's move on. Let's move on about this. Okay. Now, Alabama is called the heart of Dixie. I don't know if we're the heart of Dixie, but we're every other body part. East Alabama might as well be West Georgia. West Alabama might as well be eastern Mississippi. In Coleman County, we call Tishomingo County our lost sister, or our sister in Mississippi. Of course, Mobile should be in the Florida Panhandle. And after the Civil War, Alabama was actually offered $1 million for the Panhandle. We didn't have $1 million to buy it with, though. And of course, the Tennessee River Valley that everybody so loves actually refers to the river in Alabama from where it enters and passes Huntsville and where it leaves, having passed Decatur and gone through Florence. But which, of course, every little boy who looks at a map and sees that and says, why didn't they just bring Tennessee's boundary down to the river? But they didn't. Anyway, so as I say, everywhere in Alabama reminds you of somewhere else nearby. Alabama was largely settled by settlers from Tennessee, South Carolina, and Georgia. There were also, however, significant communities of French, German, and Scottish settlers here in Alabama as well. More miles of navigable rivers are found in Alabama than any other state. And because we had the navigable rivers, we became the great center for cotton production. Alabama was the greatest center for cotton production, not just in the United States. We were the greatest center for cotton production on the entire planet before the Civil War, which explains an awful lot of things. As this goes. Anyway, this made major towns out of Cahaba, Mobile, Montgomery, Selma, and Tuscaloosa. Cahaba is now a ghost town, and most of these cities are in places are in kind of sad shape these days when cotton finally failed. Federal census records survived for Alabama from 1830 on, except, as always, 1890, which is missing. Alabama has some state censuses, including 1850, 55, and 66. We have voter lists for 1866 and 1867. Alabama conducted a census of its Confederate veterans in 1907 that is absolutely spectacular. It asked every Confederate veteran, what county and state were you born in, what day were you born in, what did you serve in the Civil War, and where did you live? They did this again in 1921, and in 1927 they did a census of the widows of Confederate veterans. These are at the Alabama Archives, and they're also on microfilm at many libraries such as Birmingham and Wallace State. All right, Alabama has Southern history. All afternoon I've been referring you to the Birmingham Public Library. What I mean is the Lynn Henley Research Library of Southern History at the Birmingham Public Library. This is the old wing of the library. This is the greatest center for Southern research that has ever been or ever will be, And it has spectacular holdings. It has books, it has index type scripts, it has microfilm, it has newspapers, it has periodical. It has a Birmingham Archives in the basement for the Birmingham area. It has a wonderful staff as well. Online, it is even wonderful. Before you go to the Birmingham Public Library, check all the genealogy databases on their free website. It's staggering, the stuff that you can learn just from that. Okay, now, if you're going to do family history research in the South, and arguably even for a large part of the rest of the country, you could not be a better place than where you are right now in Alabama. We have a handout, I believe it's in your collection of handouts, on genealogical libraries near Wallace State. Did you know that the Allen County Fort Wayne Public Library is only 1 day's drive from here? A hard day of driving, but 1 day's drive from here, and it's the second largest library in the country. And when you're in Birmingham, you're a few hours from the state archives of Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and not that much further from the state archives of Florida and Kentucky and a lot of other states. But there's so many great places you can do research right here in Alabama. For example, the Alabama Baptist Collection at Stanford University. Now, there's a secret about Stanford University. When they went around the state microfilming church records, they did not just microfilm Baptist church records, but they microfilmed any church records any denomination was willing to let them film. And so Stanford has an excellent collection of Alabama church records on microfilm. Mobile, Huntsville, and Tuscaloosa have very special sources for research. Many counties in North Alabama have county archives. In Blount County and in Coleman County, the county archives is in the basement. In Lawrence, Morgan, St. Clair counties, the county archives is its own separate building, just to help you in doing your research. The Alabama Department of Archives and History was the first state archives in the United States history. And for many years, it has been one of the best. One of the best. I have to admit, I cheated on you today. That's right. I got up very early and stopped at the Alabama Archives on my way here to join you today. And as many times as I've been to the Alabama Department of Archives and History, today I learned a whole bunch of new stuff about Alabama records that I did not know before. Okay. Alabama has many great local libraries and resources as well. Okay. All right. Well, that concludes our talk. And yes, we did run over on time, but I'm happy to stay here and answer your questions for as long as you would like to have me. So could we have some questions from the audience? Did I, sir? He asked me if I grew up in Pickens County, Georgia. No, I grew up in a much more worse place. I grew up in Clayton County, Georgia, just south of Atlanta, where the Georgia Archives building is now. I used to play baseball in my uncle's cow pasture. Some more good questions. Oh, yes, my mother, yes, in Pickens County, Georgia, my mother's family comes from there. And I've done a lot of research. I lived there for 14 years when I was an adult. But my mother's family is from Pickens County, Georgia. Wonderful resources there. They have a spectacular genealogy room with all the county records on microfilm and all these wonderful books and newspapers. And again, modesty forbids me from mentioning the shadowy person who's responsible for that. Okay, some more good questions. Yes, ma'am. All right, the lady is asking about Hall County, Georgia. Hall County, Georgia is an incredible place. For most of its history, it always had 10% of the state's population. We have a tradition in Hall County, which is where my father's family is from. We have a tradition there that there will be at least 5 families of each surname, and they will not be related to each other, and they'll all live in the same cabin. And if anybody needs proof, I'll introduce you to my Rogers family. Okay. Hall County, the best place, always start at the state archives, and the Georgia Archives in Morrow has great resources for Hall County. After that, go about 90 miles from Atlanta to Gainesville, Georgia. And if you haven't been to Gainesville in a long time, you won't recognize the place. It's just incredible now. But go to the Hall County Public Library, which used to be the Chestatee Regional Library. They have a fabulous research room. The great Sybil McRae, who did all those newspaper articles and compiled all those files, her papers are there for you. She rescued all these county records from the dump, and they're there for you. And there's private manuscript collections. And that's the beauty of libraries, whether it's in Alabama or in Georgia or in Virginia or whatever. There are people who will type up something. They'll make one copy of it, and they'll leave it at the public library. So, like I said, public library is a great place, but particularly in Hall County. And if you have to bring somebody along with you for Hall County to, anyway, send them to Helen, Georgia, about 90 miles away, or Dahlonega, about 60 miles away, or just send them back to Atlanta. I one time, coming back from college in Dahlonega, asked my dad and I were talking about how much we didn't like Gainesville, and I said, Gainesville's a dirty, rotten little town full of dirty, rotten people. My apologies to the people of Gainesville. That's all changed, I'm sure. And then I turned to my father and I said, I'm so sorry, Dad, I forgot you were born here. And my father said, no, I couldn't agree with you more. But anyway, there's nothing in Gainesville except Lake Lanier, which used to be my Uncle Lee Martin's farm. Some more questions? Yes, ma'am. All right, excellent question. The lady is asking me about Wilkes County, Georgia. What was originally today's Wilkes County and the surrounding counties. It had at one time 40% of Georgia's population, and its records make up for a large part of the lost 1790 census of Georgia and 1810 even. Okay, first off, the greatest book, the number one book in Georgia genealogy is Grace G. Davidson's Early Records of Georgia, Wilkes County, in 2 volumes. Now, it has a trick to it. The 2 volumes are bound together, and the index to the first volume is in the middle of the book. So watch out for that. The second most popular book ever published in Georgia genealogy is the Wilkes County Papers, which modesty prevents me from mentioning who did that one. And the third most popular book in Georgia is the Georgia Black Book, Morbid, Macabre, and Sometimes Disgusting Records of Genealogical Value. No, that book does exist, and for more reasons than modesty, I'm not going to tell you who did that one. Okay, now, anyway, the Georgia Archives, if you go online to their virtual vault, they have scanned and indexed a lot of the original Wilkes County records. Now, I said that Wilkes County has every scrap of paper it ever had. Well, that's not exactly true. A lot of people pillaged the Wilkes County Courthouse for records over the years. I published them in my book, The Georgia Wilkes County Papers. That's what it's really all about, trying to bring all these. And there was a collection even I missed that they've since added to the Georgia Virtual Vault. Frank Hudson published the tax records for Wilkes County from 1785 to 1805, and that is just a spectacular set of books. And there have been other books that have been done on Wilkes County too. Some newspaper abstracts have been done for what survives of the early Washington, Georgia newspapers as that goes. But the best place for researching Wilkes County is the Georgia Archives in Atlanta, in Morrow, I beg your pardon. Wilkes County, Washington, Georgia has Georgia's oldest public library, and they do have some research sources, but there's nothing like somebody has sat down to create a Wilkes County Archives. That's really the Georgia Archives in Morrow. Some more excellent questions. preferably those that don't involve my family and Gainesville. Again, apologies for the Gainesville jokes. Some more questions? Okay, yes, ma'am. Okay, you're looking for what kind of records, ma'am?
Genealogy records.
For where?
It's near Rockford, Alabama.
It's near where?
Rockford. It's the community.
Oh, what county would that be, ma'am?
Coosa County.
Coosa County. Oh, it's in Coosa County.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Is that how you say it? Okay.
Very good. And also check the state archives, of course, in Montgomery. Now, by the way, Alabama has some pretty good regional archives and libraries. The University of West Alabama in Livingston, which I might add, if you know somebody interested in going to college in Alabama, is a fabulous place to go to school. Black, white, whatever, it's just wonderful. But they have the Wiregrass Archives, which centers on Sumter County and all the counties around there. They have the original county papers there, and they're organizing them and arranging them, and all sorts of wonderful things are turning up in their Wiregrass Archives, in their library at the University of West Alabama in Livingston. And anyway, oh, and the greatest private manuscript collections in Alabama are the Huxford Library at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And I'm planning to go there on the first day of my spring break to research some projects. Oh, and by the way, I should, in all fairness, mention Auburn University also has a fabulous special collection, and it's particularly good for East Alabama in the Opelika and the Tuskegee and Opelika, Tuskegee, and what is the other important town there? Auburn, the town of Auburn, of course. Forgive me. Auburn, Opelika, and Tuskegee. But they have a particularly good, they have resources for that as well. And I might also add the Huxford Library of the University of Alabama has an extraordinary set of county records over the years that people have donated to. But anytime you want to be thorough in looking up a county's records, be sure to always check the catalog of the Huxford Library online, and records you thought might have been gone. Surprise, surprise, they're not. They're in Tuscaloosa. They're in Tuscaloosa. Ma'am? No, you might have thought Alabama does not have such a problem with burned courthouses except in the northwest corner. Marion, Winston, out that way. However, Alabama does have a serious problem where over the years lawyers borrowed records from the courthouse and never brought them back. Blount County's first book of marriages, Blount County's first book of everything, somebody took it and never returned it. However, some of these records that are missing from the courthouses are turning up in the Huxford Library at the University of Alabama. For example, Alabama began requiring birth and death records in 1884, but the records were kept at the courthouse. A lot of these records are lost. They're not lost for Winston County. For whatever reason, their first book of births and deaths is at the Alabama Archives. And by the way, has been published. Some more good questions. Do what, ma'am? Okay. Oh, and by the way, Winston County has an archive. All right. Well, very good. If you have some questions that come to you after I'm gone, email me. It's on your sheet here, my address. Email me, and if I can answer you, if I've got an answer for you, I'll certainly share it.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
You're very welcome.
Now, if you enjoy this program, we'll have another program March 25th on military records in the Civil War. I hope y'all join us that day. Thank you.